Welcome to the Perfect Place to Put a Practice podcast by Scott McDonald and DrDemographics.com, the best source of demographic, psychographic, and marketing information for professionals.
Hello, this is Scott McDonald of Dr. Demographics, and today we're talking about a site selection factor that I think you ought to know about. Part of the thing, site selection is not a thing that changes dramatically overnight. But there are nevertheless some factors and myths that have been discussed that are trying to convince people to do certain things that may not be in your best interest. And one of those things is about population density. Now, population density has generally been considered a good thing. For a long time, we always considered having a large patient base surrounding the office was desirable. And I won't say that's wrong. You still need people to have in a practice. But what we're finding is there's a counterintuitive factor regarding population density that you've got to realize. And in fact, it's becoming rather important. For the longest time, people were putting practices in the downtown areas. They said, if I can put a practice in a major place, like near the Empire State Building, Rockefeller Center, Times Square, places like that, or Arco Plaza in Los Angeles. It was generally considered a good thing. But what we're finding now is there's a lot of reasons why you should be avoiding those locations and kind of looking elsewhere. The potential for sites will change over time. Which sites have the best potential, but also there are counterindicators that are suggesting they may not be. So let me share with you my screen and I'll tell you a little bit what I'm talking about. How dense population centers are changing the metrics on where to put a practice. So please listen to what I have to say for a minute. I think it'll make sense. A large number of locations are priced at a level that is kind of hard to bear. And that's because there's the assumption among brokers and realtors that the more dense the population is, the better it is for you. That isn't really true anymore. And really, this is a phenomenon which has developed and been studied in the last 2 years. In a post-pandemic society, this is particularly important. Now, in researching the best places to practice, I have found that someone has been fibbing to you. Now, I don't think necessarily they're doing this because they're mean-spirited or they're evil, but I think that there are some fibs going on, particularly in marketing locations and the material that is put out about them that I just want to talk to you about. Now, in reading the marketing materials on office developments and proposed new housing projects, someone has been kind of, fudging, fibbing, I don't know how you want to say it. I don't think they're necessarily evil, but I think they're wrong. And that's what I want you to know about. So let's talk about one. I'm not saying really they're fundamentally dishonest. And let me go back. My father was a real estate developer. He would do housing developments in very upscale areas and also the occasional retail outlets. And he would have me write copy that we would include with the materials that we would send to people about them. It was a good job for a kid in college who's learning about demographics. Now, I said things that weren't necessarily bad, but there's things that I think we relied on as being truisms that are not. Now, let's define what we mean by these terms so that you'll have a good handle on them. First of all, you might want to grab a pen because I want you to take some notes on these things. It's not all logical, but there is some intuition that I think you should be aware of. For example, when someone uses the term dense population, a dense population of people living and working in an area is not necessarily an asset, certainly not as in the old days. I was writing copy on some places in California and also Texas and Florida that we were using the terms population density as being synonymous with really good sites. But just because there are a lot of people living there doesn't mean those people are going to go to that office place, to that location. And in fact, what we found was population density right now is actually more of a curse than a blessing. And let me explain myself a little bit as I go on. If somebody uses the term in their advertising, it is close to downtown and an easy commute, it actually can mean exactly the opposite of what you think it does. If it's close to downtown, it usually means that the price of the property is higher, not reasonably priced. It doesn't necessarily mean that the people who work in the downtown live in the downtown area. Now, there are some people who prefer to live and work close together in the downtown area, and what they call the inner urban areas would be a good thing. But in fact, what we're finding is it may not be. Now, when we say that it's an easy commute, what they meant by that is that there is a high-speed internet, a turnpike or freeway that tied one area to the other. The easy commute didn't mean that it was short, they meant that it was direct. And just because it was direct doesn't necessarily mean it's good for your practice to be located there. They would say things in the advertising copy about these housing and business developments that they are near affordable and new housing. That is almost an oxymoron right now, because if a place is in the inner city, and that's an actual demographic term, the inner urban areas, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's affordable. They used to suggest that subsidized housing, what they refer to as Section 8 housing, was good because it was affordable and lots of people were living in those areas. City planners right now are pushing for more and more Section 8 housing. That's because it's subsidized by state, local, and federal taxes and funding mechanisms. But what we've seen is they don't retain the people in them, either as residents or work, for very long. So there's a greater and greater turnover in those populations. That is not good for a healthcare practice. Now, if it's near affordable housing, it also means it's near higher crime, and I'll talk about crime in a minute. But that's a problem. When they say that it's new housing, they just mean recently built. They don't mean desirable housing. So when there is brand new subsidized housing that is new in an urban area, you got to be very careful, because the people living there are not likely to seek health care. They're not likely to pay for it. They won't have insurance, at least private insurance, and it's a little sticky for you. Here's another term that is often used in advertising business and residential neighborhoods, and that is retail friendly. Now, I've got to tell you, it's a weird thing. If we look at strip malls, those places that are little retail centers, usually located along major transportation arteries, often surface streets, you think, well, that's good, because retail outlets have been doing better and better in retaining their value. But the problem is they're becoming exceptionally expensive locations, because the assumption is if it's retail friendly, there are lots of people, and you're going to have lots of people come there during all day parts, all different times during the day. In fact, it's not being a good buy for you to go to. Contrast that, however, with suburban retail outlets, not urban retail outlets. So the smaller Lower density suburban locations are where you want to consider going. The retail friendly urban areas are really becoming a problem because they're expensive and not retaining their people, their tenants, and that's being a problem for healthcare practices that are located near them. This is particularly true with health plazas and hospitals. Now, the other thing I want you to understand is there's a term that's thrown around all the time, and that is affluent. Oh, they're very affluent. I got to tell you an interesting truth about urban areas in densely populated areas. They are retaining a more affluent population. In other words, they have a lot of money and they're earning a lot of money, but the population per residence and per business is lower than it's ever been. So they're not having a lot of people in that small area. They're moving in and moving out quickly, but worse, they may have a lot of money, but they're not going to stick around. And very often, these urban areas have places where they will maintain separate places of work and business that may be further apart than what you were thinking about. Having proximity of residence and work is great, and the assumption is that's always going on in urban areas, but not really. So whenever they say it's affluent, you got to think twice. It's affluent per population, not affluent overall, like the people there make a lot of money. It has often been said, this is a place that has great schools. Now, this is a trick that suburban as well as urban locations, but particularly those with high density populations, often will talk about. They'll say great schools because they mean magnet or charter schools. But that's not entirely true. The way that a school is measured is what is called an API score. It's an objective measurement that says how high are the grades for the students who are there. In highly dense locations, they will sometimes fudge the API scores by saying, well, there are a lot of people who are disadvantaged here, but they're doing relatively well on their scores, and therefore it's a good school. I'd be very, very careful, because there's a disconnect between what is considered an objective measurement of a great school and a school that happens to have a good score. So I'm just saying, whenever someone says great schools, you have to say, define great schools. How do you know that? Are the schools growing in size, or are they graduating more students, or are they drawing students from further outlying areas that are highly desirable? That's kind of a thing that people who are writing advertising copy, well, they're kind of fudging a little bit. They're not being entirely honest about what a great school is because they're not giving you the measurement. The other thing is low crime. I want to have you understand how crime is measured. And I've done a whole sessions on this, but I thought you'd like to hear this. There are two ways that crime is measured: crime against people and crimes against property. Now, the BLM riots that went on were lots of crimes against both, in fact, but mainly against property. Now, because it was insured, everybody was saying, oh, there is no crime problem here because they're going to rebuild those retail centers and public buildings really quickly because they're insured. But the problem is they have not been fixed. They have fudged the scores on crime, and all those places in the inner city that were burned down or vandalized, they're not doing so well. So if you talk about the jewelry stores, the upscale Neiman Marcus and all those upscale retail centers, they are not claiming to have a lot of crime, but they do. The other problem with crime statistics is they're not measured locally. Now, you may assume, oh, crime is low in this neighborhood, and you'll think in terms of a few square blocks. But that's not how crime is measured. It's usually on a much larger geographic scale, in a precinct, for example, or a portion of a police precinct. And that means that the statistics that they're claiming represent a low crime area may not be low crime at all, because it's taking in a very large geographic area. And I could go through almost every major population center in the United States and say, if the population is densely populated, statistically, the crime may look low because, well, there just aren't that many crimes against people and property as you thought. But relative to other locations, it can be appalling and terrible. That's all I'm saying. So if it comes down to crime statistics, the population analysis that we do, how viable is the site and how realistic are their crime problems or projected crime problems in the area, I want you to know about it. And you got to get an expert to tell you this, because simple statistics that are offered, even by ESRI, which is very good, isn't sufficient typically for what you need to know. Particularly bad crimes against property that are not repaired. So there are areas in major urban areas that have been burnt out and nobody's fixed them. And this is still going on in Detroit, for example, and Chicago and Los Angeles and New York. Buildings didn't get fixed, and therefore it may not have active low crime now, but the assumption among people who live and work in the area is this isn't a good place to go. Therefore, you may be buying a pig in a poke. I also want to have you understand what they mean by a growing community. The area is growing. All right, statistically, how positive is an area, especially one that has a very dense population of people who live and work there? How much growth does it need? Now here's the thing. Growth can mean there's a lot more new people living there. In other words, there's been a lot of turnover, but they also mean growth could be they're building new housing and new office buildings. And that's the rub. Because in a lot of parts of major states, particularly on the coasts, to say that an area is growing, yes, they're having population turnover, but they're not having new office buildings or housing built. There is a problem in the United States this year getting building materials. They can't do it. So if an area is growing, they're implying, oh yeah, there's a lot of new stuff there. But the new stuff may not be a new house or a new office building. It may just mean that there's turnover in the population. Now, I'm all in favor of turnover in the population, but is the population that is turning over going to be positive or negative for you? And that's why a practice site viability report is really going to be important for you. You have to know the type of growth that is going on, not just that the numbers are shifting or changing. Now, I've mentioned this before. I think I even mentioned it last week, that the state that seems to have the most significant amount of new residents is Idaho. And you're going, Idaho? Does Idaho really have that much of a draw? Do I want to live in Idaho? Well, maybe not. Utah is growing, yes. Arizona is doing very well, thank you very much. Texas and Florida are doing very nicely. North Carolina, I love. Virginia, surprisingly, has taken off. So yes, they're growing, but their people are growing from other locations. But are they living and working in new buildings? And that may not be proven. So that's why we need to do a practice site viability report to look at what the growth that they're referring to really is. Now, when they say there is little competition, I thought this was rather interesting. I did a study last week on competition and what it really means to have a lot of competition and a little. Now, doctors always assume that competition is by its nature bad. bad competition. We don't want a lot of other doctors offering things. But the opposite is often true. The more providers there are in an area, the more reputation the area has as a place to go to seek services. So when they say there's little competition, it could be a rural or a small suburban area that there are no providers. And even though it may be, outwardly a good thing that people are moving there, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to make more money. If we look at an area like Beverly Hills, which has a lot of competition in it, or Scarsdale, well, you may say, I don't want to go to a place that has a lot of competition, but the people have a lot of money. And the people who go to those areas are prone to seek care more often, more regularly, and at a higher price. So little competition can be a little bit of a negative term, something you don't really want to have. And once again, that's why the analysis will help you. Doing a flat ratio, let's say you're a general dentist and you're looking at 1,400 to 1 general dentist per population. You may say, well, that's good, but it doesn't happen in only a 5-minute area. You've got to look at the 10 and the 15-minute drive times as well to determine, is the population coming from the out of town area and are they spending money? Now, I do want to tell you, I just read this one. This ad talked about how great it is that this site is close to a major university. Now, look, I went as an undergraduate and graduate school student. I love the university. I teach at a major university. That's great. But it also is an indication of bad business because college students and professors don't make a lot of money. So therefore, unless it is a teaching university of healthcare, it's going to be tough. But even then, if you look at the major medical and dental schools, the reason that they're located where they are is because there are a lot of low-income households that are seeking public assistance and have some kind of Medicare insurance, and that's how they survive. But that isn't necessarily going to help you if you're trying to have a more upscale practice. So being close to a major university doesn't necessarily help. Now, being close to a major a major employer with good transportation, that's a different story. And in fact, that's turning itself around. So finding places that is increasing the number of people who work near a site may be a major boon to you. Universities, shopping centers, maybe not so much. Now, there are a few things that I want you to keep in mind. So forgive me. The list of terms that realtors and developers keep handy are really meant to do one thing, and that is to catch your interest in the property. It's not to objectively describe the property itself. Just keep in mind, I'm not saying that these people are being dishonest. I'm just saying they may be saying things that are not really going to help you. That's what I'm getting at. Now, I loved The Princess Bride, how Diego Montoya said to Vicini, you keep using that term. I do not think that word means what you think it means. And I say that because these advertising terms are very much like that kind of thing where you may assume that they mean something that they really don't. Now, look, I want you to have a successful career. I want you to find locations that are going to pay off. But if you're looking for the advertising sales, sometimes the slickest advertising flyers may not be what you think they are. They may be trying to tell you something, but you're going to have to read between the lines, and a good demographer can really help you to find that. So that's what Dr. Demographics is all about, to help act on your behalf to tell you what you need to know. The terms imply that there are benefits that you are seeking. But remember, an implication is not the same thing as an objective fact. I have a very good friend right now who has been doing a lot of analysis of agreements on properties for real estate. And what he is really good at is understanding the difference between a real benefit and a real fact that is going to be important to you that may not appear to be a benefit right now. I'll just say experience will really help you a lot. The benefits mentioned must be very specific and they must be quantifiable. So it doesn't matter to me that someone says we have a lot of growth. How much growth, not by percentage alone, but rather in actual numbers of residents and businesses, people employed in an area, that's specific and it's quantifiable. If you don't have that, any kind of advertising copy on a location, whether it's a residential or a commercial site, matters a lot. Things are going south a little bit in the economy. You don't have the luxury of screwing this up. Benefits must be stated and not implied. In other words, give it to me straight, let me know. And healthcare practices do not use the same math that other businesses do. So if you go online and it says, well, this is a good growth, or that's a good number of people per population, or this is average for income, I wouldn't be so sure. Keep this in mind. When it comes to looking at how much money people have, a median household income does not carry a value. It isn't good or bad. It's only good or bad if you consider the median household income relative to the overhead for the site. Then it has meaning. So let us do the calculations for you. Let us help you figure out where to go and the best place to put your practice. Now, the practice potential report is about $800, $795. Specialists can be a little bit more because it's more complicated. It includes a lot more data. But you can get a sample report at drdemographics.com. You can always give us a call at 800-849-0499. You can't afford to make expensive long-term mistakes. So spend a little money, get your research, and then jump on it like a duck on a June bug. And thank you so much for watching.